Hello and welcome to this CPD talk on the portfolios. So this is going to be a little bit different from normal. This talk is going to be split into two different sections and it is not specific to haematology and blood transfusion. Instead, this is pathology based. So you could be working in microbiology and this talk would still be relevant to you, for example. So the talk will be split into registration portfolio and specialist portfolio. This is part one, so we're going to go through the registration portfolio. If you want to listen to the part and specialist portfolio, that's going to be a separate talk. Hopefully will be coming out the following week for you to have a look through. So how are we going to start? We're going to go through the general process of progression in biomedical science. Then in this talk, we're going to go through the registration portfolio, why you'd complete the portfolio and the process of obtaining a portfolio, overview of what is expected in the portfolio, good and bad evidence, and examples of how to put together 3 pieces of evidence for each section. Then in our second talk, we'll go over the specialist portfolio and we'll be following a very similar contents. Now this talk is specifically obviously aimed at people that are looking at doing the registration portfolio, but it would also be of use if you are looking at trying to help someone complete the registration portfolio, so you have an idea of exactly what they should be looking at doing. The first thing we're going to go through is the process of progression in biomedical science. The way that you progress in this career will very much depend on your background and the hospital you work in. So depending on what degree you've done, that will then alter how you will progress. And depending on what hospital you work in, they will have a preference on what qualifications are best for you to progress up the ranks. So I split the majority of the qualifications that you would complete into this quick flow chart. So we're going to start at the beginning, degree completed in biomedical science. So this is kind of generic. There are 3 different types of degree that you can complete to become a biomedical scientist. The first one is an accredited biomedical science degree. That is the gold standard, and that's the one that really, if you haven't chosen your degree yet, that you'd want to go for if you wanted the career in biomedical science. You've then got an unaccredited biomedical science degree, which basically means that IBMS have not approved the modules in that degree and they've not seen them as being good enough for you to become a biomedical scientist. That doesn't mean that the modules themselves aren't good, they just might not have the content specific to becoming a BMS. And the final one is just a generic science degree. You can convert from the unaccredited biomedical science degree and the generic science degree to an accredited biomedical science degree. That normally has a decent amount of cost involved. You would have to send the modules that you have completed to the IBMS. They would review these and then they would tell you what top-up modules you would need to complete to have completed an accredited course. Once you've done that and you've managed to get yourself an accredited degree in biomedical science, the next thing you need is laboratory experience. So again, depending on your degree, if you have done a sandwich course, you might have already had that. If you haven't, then a lot of people have to start off as a band 2 or 3 and work their way up to be able to be a BMS. So while you're getting that laboratory experience, you should be trying to work towards a registration portfolio. You need the registration portfolio before you are a biomedical scientist. So this portfolio should be generic. Even if you are training in a specific area, say for example, haematology and transfusion, if you get the registration portfolio completed and you decide you want to work in biochemistry, this qualification would still be enough for you to do that. And that is why it's really important when you're gathering your evidence that it could be used in each different department. But we'll go through that more later. Once you have completed your registration portfolio, congratulations, you're a biomedical scientist. It takes a little while for you to be put on the register, but it's pretty much in essence all you have to do. You then have to decide which area you want to work in. You can change discipline after this, but now is really where you want to make that decision, because the next qualification that you do is sort of going to lock in that decision. So if you weren't sure at this stage, say you'd worked for a little while in haematology and you didn't think it was for you, you would want to start looking at moving around before you started your next qualification. To get to a band 6, you need to complete one of 3 qualifications. The one that our hospital recommends, and I think that the majority of hospitals would push for, is the specialist portfolio. This is again another qualification that is created by the IBMS, and it is very similar to the registration portfolio in its format and how it will relate your knowledge to your actual experience in the lab. And that's why a lot of hospitals like it, is because it's taking background knowledge and it's also putting in skills that you would use in everyday work. The next one is the BBTS. This is a blood transfusion specific qualification. So again, it's similar to the specialist portfolio in that it is very comprehensive and has stuff to do with actual in the lab activities. However, you are very much narrowing your field there because it is just for transfusion, so it's not haematology, and it costs a lot more than the specialist portfolio. So some hospitals will not support you in going for that qualification. The final option is a master's. Now, the issue with the master's is it gives you all sorts of background knowledge, but it is not bringing those into play within the laboratory. So a lot of hospitals are not keen on that. It's not one of the most favourite ways of getting that career advancement. On top of that, it is of course the most expensive because you're looking at thousands of pounds instead of hundreds of pounds. So with the NHS budgets the way they are, you quite often will not get funding for these. Once you have done one of those 3, you would still have to go for an interview, but you've got the qualifications that you would need to become a band 6. If you then want to further progress, you could still use a master's for that. So a band 7, you need a master's equivalent qualification. If you've done the master's, then you're not going to have the same experience in the lab and you might struggle in interviews. Plus, you know, the specialist portfolio is specifically linking it to the way that we are testing things. The master's might not be, depending on what master's you're doing. So there are pros and cons to it. The other way that you can progress to a band 7 is through one of the IBMS higher specialist diplomas. So there are several different types here, and again they become even more specific than the specialist portfolio. So say for example, sticking with haematology and transfusion, I've done the haematology and transfusion specialist portfolio. When I'm doing the higher specialist, I would choose one of those 2 to specialise in, or I would choose quality, or I would choose training, depending on the job role that I want. The good thing with the higher specialist diploma is they're a bit more generic in that they all have items in them about leadership and about quality and training. Therefore, they are easier to be used for other roles in comparison to the specialist portfolio. So that is basically the overall background of progression in biomedical science. I'm hoping that makes sense. Obviously, if you have any questions about that, then you can contact me, but the majority of our preferred routes are in our training policy on QPOL, so please feel free to have a look at that. So now we're going to move into the actual registration portfolio. Starting with why do we complete a portfolio? So as I've mentioned a couple of times, the degree gives a lot of theoretical knowledge of all of the biomedical disciplines, however does not have much information on actually working in the laboratory. The portfolio, however, is a way of showing that you understand and uphold the HCPC and IBMS standards. It gives lots of learning points that you might not pick up just by working in the laboratory. So, for example, in the lab you'll hear us talking about UCAS a lot, but if you haven't had or haven't gone through the registration portfolio, you might not know what UCAS actually is, or what the standards mean, or why we're even trying for UCAS accreditation. So the registration portfolio gives you that background knowledge, and of course it allows you to progress your career. Obtaining the registration portfolio. So again, this will vary on where you're working and your circumstances. Within NKPS, registration portfolios are normally given to trainees as part of their job roles. Band 3s are also sometimes given these. This can cause issues with support being properly provided though. I don't know how many of you have been in this scenario, but if you are a Band 3 who has been given a registration portfolio, normally it's not seen as a priority to give the time to mark or the support on what you are doing with the portfolio, and therefore you also are not given study time to complete it. So normally if you're a Band 3 and you're given the portfolio, it's very difficult to actually get that progression. Whereas if you're a trainee, as part of that, you should be given time to do your portfolio work, and you should be given the one-to-one support with a training officer. So the training officer will ensure that your application is put forward, and depending on whether you are financing your own portfolio or the hospital is financing it, a study request form may be needed to be completed. I'm not going to spend forever going through these request forms. If it comes to a point where you need a portfolio or to go on a course or something that costs money, then obviously go and talk to the person who is putting you forward for that, and they can talk you through that form. So what is expected of the portfolio? The registration portfolio can be split into 3 main parts: training/competence, the portfolio itself, and the assessment and laboratory tour. So the training and competence. When completing registration portfolio, you must have demonstrated that you are learning and being trained in the areas that you have been working. This is where competencies and a training plan will be used. It's basically a way of saying that you haven't just sat in a room and just Googled everything and that's how you're getting the information. It's to show that not only are you getting support, but that you are working in that area and helping to progress. So this will be something that your training officer should prepare with you. The portfolio itself. So the portfolio is meant to be a document that shows that you're upholding the HCPC standards. It does so in the following format. It's split into 2 sections, each with 5 modules. And each of these modules will have a list of knowledge-based and competency-based standards that should be met within the section. The candidate should then choose 3 pieces of evidence which demonstrate these. How this is done is up to the candidate. They can use a wide range of evidence as long as all 3 pieces of evidence together cover the required standards. So what this means is, say we're on section 1, module 2, and there are a list of 7 different knowledge-based / competency-based standards. The 3 pieces of evidence that you choose to create must cover all 7. So you could have evidence 1 will cover 3, 5 and 6, evidence 2 will cover 1, 2, 3, and evidence 3 will cover 4 and 7. You can also have overlapping bits, so you could have one evidence cover 1, 2, 3, 4, second evidence cover 4, 6, 7, etc. As long as you are covering all of those knowledge-based and competency-based standards, you can do that in any way that you want. In our lab, for section 1, there is a list of questions for each module that you can use as one of your pieces of evidence. Those questions are based on the knowledge and competency-based standards, so they should give you a start-off point with the basic covering of all of those standards, so that then you are just supplying supplementary evidence to help ensure that you are showing good understanding of the questions that you have answered. In section 2, it's a lot more to do with what you are doing in the lab and laboratory processes, so we don't currently have questions available for these. When selecting your evidence, you probably want to speak to your training officer if you are unsure as to what is good and what is bad evidence. So once this is marked, together you'll decide if it needs more work and if there are any areas that you may require help with. Then once it's all completed, it will be put in for an assessment. So the assessment and laboratory tour. Once completed, the training officer will arrange a date with the verifier to come and assess the portfolio. Obviously, currently due to COVID, there are some changes to this, where things may be done electronically instead of person. We haven't had any of those assessments happen yet, so I'm not 100% sure on the format, but it's something that I'm sure we will learn more about, and I imagine going forward that the general way that the registration portfolio is examined might change as a result of this. There are two parts to the assessment. The first is the laboratory tour. In this, you basically follow a sample around your department, give a brief overview of the laboratory and the analyzers, including things like fire exits, QCs, NEQAS, basically a culmination of everything that you've worked on in your portfolio. It is a timed walk though, so the assessor can stop you if you overrun. So it's really important to practice this walk before your assessment. Then the assessor gets 30 minutes to go through your portfolio. So this is why you're limited to 3 pieces of evidence per section, because as I'm sure you're aware, 30 minutes is a very short period of time to have to go through all of that work that you've put together. It's also why you have to really clearly cover those standards in your pieces of evidence, because if you've just covered something in one little sentence, it's very easy for the examiner to miss. So the evidence itself. This is something that can be confusing. What is evidence? Depending on who you talk to will depend on what they count as evidence. In general, evidence is anything that can prove that you are meeting that standard. So it could be a question and answer, because in the answer you've proved you've understood the question and that you can come up with a cohesive, correct answer. It could be a witness statement, because you have followed a procedure that has shown that you can adhere to that standard. Reflective practice. If you have done something in the lab where you've taken a screenshot, then it could be annotated photos or diagrams. If you do use any pieces of evidence where it's a photo or a diagram or a leaflet, it has to be annotated to show that you understand what that resource means. You cannot just add a random photo in the middle of your work. That's not good evidence. A piece of evidence can be up to 3 years old. So question and answer, obviously, you could have answered that 4 or 5 years ago. If the answers are still right, that's not going to have a date or time on it, so that can still be used. If you've dealt with a patient sample, that's going to have a date and time on it, and it has to be from within the last 3 years. And how do you know that you have met the standards? This is what your training officer is basically checking when they're marking their work. However, when you are actually creating the evidence, I recommend having your portfolio book with you and actually looking at what you are trying to create, because it will have those standards written out for you. If you've got a standard that's asking you to talk about how you communicate effectively with different groups of people, e.g. age, disability, and you've written a piece of evidence that doesn't mention ages or disabilities in it, then you obviously haven't met that standard. So having that list for each section next to you is vital when creating your evidence. So what is a good piece of evidence and what's a bad piece of evidence? I'm not actually going to go into that in much detail, and that's because there is actually a presentation about this on QPulse, and I have linked the document number in the description below. As I said before, if you use images or text extracts, you need to annotate or talk about them. If you do not have anything to say about them, then they are not relevant and shouldn't be used. Essays are not the best evidence. They can be very useful, however they are big bulks of text, and when you come to do your specialist portfolio, you're not actually allowed to put just straight essays in there as evidence. It's a lot better to have it broken up, A, because it's easier for the examiner actually to find your evidence and what you're talking about, and B, because you just writing a load of information that you've taken off of Google is not proving that you understand anything. Evidence that involves you completing a task or reflecting on a task is really good, because obviously it's showing that you can perform that task. And just a reminder that portfolios can still be assessed for plagiarism. So if you have copied and pasted, I can tell when I'm marking it, the examiner is going to be able to tell, and they can put it forward as a possible plagiarism, and they will run it through a computer program, and you will fail as a result of it, and it shows you're not meeting the HCPC standards. So please, if you are using text from another source, reference it, put it in quotation marks. If you're using something to influence what you're writing, then obviously you can use that information, but rearrange it, put it in your own words. Please don't just copy and paste. So, how to build your 3 pieces of evidence. We have discussed evidence, so let's have a look at a working example. So we're going to have a look at section 1 and module 3, which is on communication. So you can see here I have got the knowledge part of this on the screen, and there are 5 knowledge SOPs that we need to meet. So you've got understand how communication skills affect assessment of and engagement with service users, be aware of the characteristics and consequences of verbal and non-verbal communication, understand the need to provide service users or people acting on their behalf with the information necessary to enable them to make informed decisions, understand the need to assist the communication needs of the service users, and recognise the need to use interpersonal skills to encourage the active participation of service users. There are questions, and on QPOS they are split into K and C. K is for knowledge, C is for competence. So they are specifically split into each of the knowledge sections. But when you're building your other 2 pieces of evidence, if you do use the questions, I would have these standards in front of you, and I would try and put together pieces of evidence that work and cover as many standards as possible in one. So if we have a look at this piece of information, you can see that C on competence, demonstrate effective and appropriate verbal and non-verbal skills, is very similar to 2, be aware of characteristics and consequences of verbal and non-verbal communication, in knowledge. So those 2 can definitely be linked together. There are also a lot of other ones where you'd be able to link them together. So this might be in, for example, a witness statement of you communicating with a service user, whether it be phoning to say that you have rejected a sample, or giving out information about results if you're allowed to. Another good one for this section would be going through all the different communication methods used within your laboratory. So service users do not just include patients, they include other clinicians. So it might be something like saying, oh yeah, so in our lab we phone results, we have a generic email, there is a weekly notification that goes around the hospital, we have a WhatsApp messaging group between colleagues, we have a whiteboard where we put up important communications, we have communication documents on QPOS. If you're going through and listing all of these, you can say how it is including the different service users and the different groups. So people who are older, younger, they're people who are deaf, people who are blind, all of these sorts of bits of information. So you can see how you can use one piece of evidence to deal with several different knowledge/competency tasks. And it's in doing this that you're going to end up creating good, robust pieces of evidence that deal with the HCPC standards of practice in an obvious and clear way for the person examining you. So we went through the first paragraph just now. And again, once you've done this for one section and got that understanding in your head, it becomes a lot easier to come up with those evidence ideas for further sections. And your training officer is there to guide you. So if you have an idea and you're not sure, you can always ask them whether or not there's anything that they would add, or if they had any other ideas on what you wanted to do. It is your portfolio, and a portfolio is something that is very personal. So you can make it as creative and colourful as you want. and it should be a slightly enjoyable experience. I know that it is very frustrating and it's a big piece of work, but if you make it your own, it's something that you're going to end up being proud of, and it is something that you can return to. I still have my registration portfolio. It is not the current version because it's from a few years ago now. However, it's still looking at the same HCPC standards, so it still has evidence in it that is useful when I'm trying to discuss things in this portfolio. Now you're an expert. Hopefully this has given you an overview of how the registration portfolio should work and how to begin. If you do have any further questions, obviously you are more than welcome to come and find me and we can discuss this together, or send me an email. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to next time. I will see you all later. Bye!